Hey, welcome wherever you are in the world or in the UK. Welcome to my channel. I'm going to cut straight into this one, straight to the subject matter. The Olympics. I watched the closing ceremony yesterday. One always gets a slightly sad feeling with the closing ceremony, like it's an end of a mini era, so to speak. For me, it's always a slightly sad feeling. I have to say, under the circumstances, considering there was a very skeptical Japanese public, considering the world is still in the middle of a pandemic or in a pandemic, considering the controversies around some of the organizers, I have to say Tokyo done a pretty good job of this. This was always going to be a challenging game. The opening ceremony was unconventional. The closing ceremony a bit unconventional. I thought the way they done the handover was superb. I thought the French put on a very good demonstration with the fly past the Eiffel Tower and President Macron looking on and the Olympians in I don't think it was Arc de Triomphe somewhere else, but I thought that was very well done. For me, it's one of the most memorable handovers. Of course, Paris is hosting in 2024, but I think Tokyo can be proud. It's not for me to say how the Japanese people should feel. I wonder if Britain was hosting an Olympic Games now, how we would feel. We've held big football events, so one could argue that if football gets this sort of pass to go ahead, then why shouldn't another sporting event? Well, of course, you don't get any bigger than the Olympics. But yeah, I think Japan can be proud. Anyway, it's not Japan I want to talk about here, it's China. China and the Olympics. Now, let me just say as a starting point, getting medals in an Olympic Games always has a degree of patriotism involved. And the UK, incidentally, we are billed as Team GB in Northern Ireland. Um, we picked up 65 medals in this event. That's equaling London 2012 and just two short of our 67 in Rio de Janeiro. That means in just 9 years, Team GB has got an incredible almost 200 medals, probably more than 200, including the Winter Games, which amounts to about a quarter, a little bit more than, or a little bit less than a quarter of all the medals we've ever got since 1896 and the first modern games in Athens. We've got over 900, I believe the figure is 945. 945 medals for this country. So if you're British and you like any sports, you can't help but feel proud of that. That actually places us as the second most highest performing nation after the United States. Soviet Union got more, but it was a federation of states. If you look at the all-time medals table, now to be fair, there were successor states like East Germany and so on. But whatever way we look at it, Britain is a major, major power in the Olympics. So, as a Briton and as someone who likes watching these events and likes a number of sports, of course I'm proud of that. We, it's something that we can look at collectively. It's not a left-wing thing, it's not a right-wing thing, it's sports and it's something that we can look at. And I suspect that's a similar thought process of most countries. And like I said, when smaller countries get medals, it's great for a sense of morale. Particularly countries that are troubled and they usually get bad news. So for someone like Afghanistan to get a medal is a big thing. Um, Needless to say, the host nation getting medals, that's always good. So Japan done well this year. So for most countries, there is pride involved. But I believe that China takes it to another level. I think they sort of see the Olympics as almost akin to a non-fatal battlefield. Because to me, they go well beyond just a bit of national pride. They take it so seriously. And not so seriously in the sense that athletes need to take it seriously because it's training and sacrifice. Seriously in the sense of kind of national face. Like if we don't get medals, then it's an assault on our reputation. Now, if Team GB didn't do well in a particular year, probably we would ask questions. Probably we'd assess what went wrong. I don't think that British athletes would be abused in the same way. Now, I know the British footballers were abused recently, and that's something that football needs to address. But when it comes to the Olympics, I do think it's a fundamentally different attitude from a country like the UK and a totalitarian state like China. Um, but this is found in so many areas. So, just one example, there was a young Japanese gymnast, um, Daishi, let me just get the guy's name right. I did look this up before making the video, but Daiki Hashimoto, 19-year-old gymnast. Now, because he got the gold and his Chinese rival got the silver, lo and behold, he got subject to abuse from Chinese netizens. And the prevailing mindset was he cheated, or the Chinese guy should have won, and the Japanese judges are corrupt. I didn't see the precise event, so I can't comment on the exact details, but frankly, it doesn't really matter. Judges sometimes make mistakes, and they shouldn't, and there should be inquiries or, retrospect on that. But I haven't seen any other country behave, or countries' supporters behave the way China's does. Um, there was a British boxer, and she landed her Chinese opponent on the canvas. Now, she didn't win the fight, but she did land her on the canvas. Nevertheless, the judges awarded that round to the Chinese fighter. Now, did British people rush to abuse this Chinese fighter and say she was cheating and she was benefited from being in an Asian country? No. Um, I think the fact that it's in Japan certainly exacerbates this mentality. Oh, it's the Japanese, they must be in it for us Chinese. But here's the irony, China does very well in the Olympics in terms of medals. In this Olympics, I think it came second to the United States, and I think they got more, unless I'm mistaken, they got more, the Americans got more overall medals, but the Chinese got more medals in one of the categories. I can't remember. But the point is, they done very well. Even doing well, we still see this nationalistic hypersensitivity and whining and complaining all the time. I've personally seen it. The first time I worked in China, I remember some of my students. This was at a summer camp. It wasn't my main school. Two young guys. They were university students, and they were asking me why in London, 2012, had the British judges made a decision in a certain way, and they wanted to make a whole big thing about it. I didn't actually know what they were talking about, but it's almost like they expected me as a Briton to defend this. So what you get with China is this hypersensitivity, and it translates into abuse of athletes, abuse of officials. Um, I get it. If you think something's been done unfairly, then that is frustrating. And judges sometimes, they do make obviously bad decisions. That's wrong. I can understand athletes being frustrated by that. But to get to the point where you are actually trolling an athlete's page, it's pathetic. This is something with the Olympics that I think is largely unique to China. I haven't seen any other country. I could be wrong, but I haven't seen any other country act in such a hyper nationalistic way. Maybe it's comparable to some of the old Soviet bloc or Warsaw Pact countries, because they were also pretty nationalistic when it came to the Olympics. I'm not saying Western countries aren't, but I don't think the public attitude is the same. I mean, the British public enjoy the Olympics. We want our Olympians to do well, but you don't get the same level of, for example, British people rushing to the internet to abuse Chinese athletes. It just isn't comparable. But there's this is a very ugly trend. I mean, we also see even Chinese athletes are abused by netizens. If they get silver, that's not good enough. They need to hide their head in shame. Um, it's a very, very intense thing. I mean, Chinese athletes, I think they're tools of the state. I wonder how much individuality they have as athletes, because it seems if they don't all get golds, then they're shamed. It's not good enough. Um, but I was getting quite angry reading some of the comments of these Chinese netizens. So hysterical, so over the top. And I think I retorted to someone saying, "You don't want fairness. What you really want is for China to get all the medals." Because to the mindset of a Chinese netizen, if a Chinese competitor falls short, oh well, the other side must have an anti-China bias, or they must be cheating, or something. And this is ironic because if, I mean, put it this way, if the Japanese judges were biased against the Chinese, why did the Chinese do so well this time? It's a contradiction, and it just shows a flaw in their argument. But to me, this is all symbolic of a sort of rising neo-nationalism that comes from that part of the world, and it is very intense, and it is very, very indoctrinated into the general public. It's indoctrinated into the education system, but we see it at the Olympics. It's ironic when I hear Chinese netizens whine about sportsmanship. They don't know the meaning of the word. For them, sportsmanship is win at all costs. Um, I mean, I don't see much respect coming from Chinese netizens. I'm not going to attack all Chinese Olympians, but there are a few, like Sun Wang, the swimmer, who very arrogant. There was a controversy with him a few years ago where his Australian and British competitors were complaining about a doping scandal. His attitude to that, you know, I don't know if he was guilty or not of the charges, but I know that he failed at least one test. Anyway, his attitude was very aggro. He actually got into the face of the British guy at one point. So, in my opinion, he should have been disqualified for unsportsmanlike behaviour. But then, of course, Chinese netizens would be out with their pitchforks. There is a very, very ugly mindset going on here, and it's very obvious. I am not attacking every Chinese sports fan. I am saying that this is something that is very palpable and it always goes hand in hand with Olympic Games. Um, that brings me to, I mean, there's other areas. There was a Chinese Olympian, and you know, she was asked about her looks in an interview. So the way they treat their own athletes is not exactly respectful either. I just think that they need to chill out a bit, accept that this is not a war. This is a sporting event. That's what it is. Um, it's a big sporting event. It's the biggest, but I personally think the rest of the world's getting a little bit fed up with China's arrogance. I mean, you cannot demand respect and not show any in return. Doesn't work that way. Um, but that brings me to the Winter Olympics next year, which of course is held in Beijing. I think it's a travesty. I fundamentally don't think that the IOC should be rewarding a regime like China when it is in the middle of industrial scale persecution of a minority group, when it is has largely been responsible for this pandemic by not coming clean in those very critical early days, by punishing the whistleblower doctors. It enabled the pandemic to spread. And their attitude ever since has been deflection and to try and blame others and pushing conspiracy theories. Um, so, any Chinese who complains about the Tokyo Olympics, I would just remind them that had it not been for the pandemic that began in China, this would be a more normal Olympics. Um, but what we're going to see next year in Beijing, unquestionably, will be a massive PR exercise by Beijing to um, to promote their power and how wonderful China is. And with an opening ceremony, there's always cultural events, and that's harmless on the surface. But I would scrutinize very closely what China or how China goes about this. One thing that has to be said: it's a Winter Olympics. It won't be as big as Beijing 2008 because it won't be as fresh. It's not the first time China's hosted, and it's a Winter Games. Winter Games are generally a little bit more low key than Summer Games. Nevertheless, it is still an Olympic Games, and you can be absolutely sure that the CCP will be using it as a propaganda exercise. I'll be looking at something in the opening ceremony showing Xinjiang culture, and oh look how wonderful we treat the Uyghurs. Some sort of lie like that. Um, that brings me to the question of boycotts. That's always a difficult one. I was just browsing this book yesterday. Steve Redgrave, great British rower, six-time Olympian medalist, and it's full of prominent Olympic moments, famous Olympic moments. And he mentioned as an athlete how frustrated he was with the 1980 Moscow and 1984 Los Angeles boycotts because it inadvertently affects athletes. And that's always the part that I'm a little bit unsure about because I'm not sure that it's fair on those athletes. They train hard, they sacrifice hard. But then the bigger question is, well, should totalitarian states be rewarded by being given a platform? Berlin, Third Reich, was rewarded in 1936. There was no games in 40 and 44 because of World War II. Um, could we see the 2012 Beijing Winter Olympics in a similar light to the 1936 Berlin Olympics? It's plausible. I really don't think there's that much difference between the two states. They're both totalitarian, they both brutally crush dissent, they both lie on an industrial scale, they're both sending persecuted minorities to concentration camps, and they're both promoting hyper nationalism. But if anything, China today is an even more complex challenge because I mean the Third Reich didn't have the internet. The Third Reich didn't have economic clout in the same way. So I really do think we face a profound challenge, but a boycott's a difficult one because it could backfire. How effective were the 80 and 84 boycotts? Who knows? But I do think that and I think there was also a partial boycott with the 1988 Seoul Games. But I do think at the very least we should send out a message to Beijing. I don't think we should send any government representation. Athletes, okay. It would be unfair to penalise them. But I think we should send out a message. Don't send any formal government delegation. Send out a message. We're not going to, honour you as hosts. We're not going to solicit this. We'll send our athletes, but this is something that I think closer to the time is going to be scrutinised. I mean, my goodness, it's August, and the Winter Games usually about February, so that isn't even that far away. Um, My big fear is that we'll see a big increase in the nationalism like we did with the 2008 games. One thing I don't think will happen, but I think it would be an absolute travesty if it did, would be this international torch relay that occurred in 2008. Now, what we saw with that was angry confrontations between pro-Tibet, pro-human rights demonstrators on one hand and Chinese nationalists on the other. I think it was abhorrent to see British police officers literally pushed out of the way by those minder guys in blue, if you recall the Beijing Olympics. Hard to believe it was 13 years ago now, but in a sense, for me, that was my first sort of observation of rising Chinese nationalism, and I think we'll see it again. But there will probably not be a torch relay because the pandemic probably won't be totally gone. But I really think that for this to be used as an opportunity for the CCP, it's kind of stomach turning. While people are lingering in concentration camps, whilst basic freedom is being torn away in Hong Kong. I just think that whilst they're throwing their weight around in the Pacific, I really think that, in a sense, this is a litmus test. I am convinced the world can't keep going the way it's going. We can't. The free world cannot continue to just be okay with China's behaviour. What I mean by China's behaviour, I mean making demands of respect and not showing any respect in return. I mean this ugly mix of hypersensitivity and ultranationalism and thinking that playing the victim can cover up their lies and their crimes. I just think that this is something that's going to keep coming up. It's not going to go away. China's going to be powerful for a very long time. And I think that one of the most visible signs of that increase in confidence is this hypernationalism. I know I keep reiterating it, but I think it's a very, very important point. So I think at the very least with Beijing, we should send no formal government representation. Um, I think that any attempt by the Chinese regime to kind of play propaganda, especially in our airwaves, should be prohibited. So, for example, any advertisements promoting Chinese companies or the Chinese government in British newspapers or magazines should be completely a no-go. Um, what we should do is, I don't think a full boycott will go ahead, but I think there's a moral argument that it probably should. It's a difficult one because on one hand I'm thinking of the athletes. It would be unfair with all the on training they've went through. They can't help the politics. But it might be that if we did go for a full boycott, then what we could do is kind of help those athletes to still compete under a neutral flag. But then probably the IOC has rules on that. So, I could understand their frustration, but you're measuring up the frustrations and the sacrifice of athletes, which ultimately is not life and death. It's depriving them of opportunities. It's hard, but you're weighing that up against human rights, and in that sense, there's no comparison. Ultimately, sports is sports. I mean, as Steve Redgrave said after the Munich massacre and after the Atlanta bombing of 1996, um, sometimes athletes have to find their humanity and remember that sports isn't life and death. It's not as big as that. It's big, but it's not as big as that. So, um, I don't know. With a boycott, you're weighing up the what the athletes put into it versus the bigger picture, because it is a bigger picture. Finally, anyone who thinks that politics and Olympics have no connection, it's just extremely naive. I think at this point we can discard that notion. Inevitably, there will always be overlap. It's just inevitable. When you have the world's biggest sporting events, when you have geopolitical tensions, when those things come together, I think it's impossible to avoid. And when a totalitarian regime like China is hosting this event, to say that there won't be in politics involved with the best will in the world, it just isn't going to happen. It is political. And I think that, particularly with the opening ceremony, not so much the events, that will probably go as a standard Olympic Games, but the opening ceremony is what I'm talking about because I think it's highly, highly likely that the Chinese regime will use it as a PR exercise. They'll use it to promote Uyghur culture and show, oh, look, the whole world has misunderstood us. We actually treat the Uyghurs really well. They shouldn't be allowed to carry out that lie. There could even be something like the athletes boycotting the opening ceremony or something, but again, that's not a straightforward question. I just think that there has to be some way to send out a message to Beijing that they can't do as they please. And at the moment, I think there's a lot more we can do. Johnson administration, to be fair, has done more than previous British governments, but there's more we can do.